During the restoration work, specialists uncovered a hidden detail in the enslaved girl's clothing that no one had noticed before. Dr. Sarah Chen gently positioned the daguerreotype beneath the digital microscope, her breathing slow and careful as she focused. The image in front of her was deeply unsettling. A young black girl, no older than 12, stood stiffly beside a well-dressed white man in front of a grand mansion with tall columns. New Orleans, 1858. The plate had arrived at the Smithsonian Conservation Lab 3 weeks earlier, donated by an estate in Baton Rouge, and Sarah had been assigned to restore and authenticate it. The daguerreotype was astonishingly well preserved, its silver surface still catching the light after 166 years. Yet something about the girl's face disturbed Sarah. Most enslaved people photographed in that era showed blank, empty expressions, a kind of emotional shield against constant cruelty. This girl was different. Her eyes did not show rebellion exactly, but they carried intent, purpose. Sarah increased the microscope's magnification and shifted her focus to the girl's clothing. The dress was plain, made of rough cotton typical for enslaved children, with a crude collar and long sleeves despite the summer brightness suggested by the photograph. As Sarah examined the fabric closely, searching for damage that might need repair, something unusual caught her attention. Along the left sleeve, barely visible even at 40 times magnification, were tiny marks. At first, Sarah assumed they were stains or damage to the silver coating, but when she adjusted the light angle, her pulse quickened. These marks were not random. They formed shapes, letters, numbers. She leaned back, blinked hard, then looked again. The markings were unbelievably small, stitched directly into the fabric with threads so thin it was almost invisible. Sarah's hands shook as she reached for her documentation camera. She had restored hundreds of 19th century photographs, yet she had never encountered anything like this. The numbers were clear now, precise coordinates, latitude and longitude, carefully embroidered into the sleeve of a child who had no voice, no legal rights, and no recorded name in any archive Sarah had searched. This girl had left a message hidden in plain sight for 166 years. Sarah picked up her phone, her thoughts racing. Whatever those coordinates led to, someone had wanted it discovered. By morning, Sarah had barely slept. She spent the night cross-checking the coordinates, 29.95 and 90.71, against historical maps of Louisiana. They pointed to a spot roughly 30 miles northwest of New Orleans, an area that would have been dense swampland in 1858. Today, it lay within a protected wildlife preserve near Lake Pontchartrain. She arrived at the lab before sunrise, carrying the daguerreotype to the main conservation theater so senior staff could review her discovery. Dr. Marcus Williams, the department head, arrived at 7. He was a careful man in his 60s who had spent 40 years authenticating historical photographs and did not accept dramatic claims easily. "Show me," he said, sitting down at the microscope. Sarah walked him through every step, explaining how she had noticed the stitching while examining fabric wear. Marcus remained silent for several minutes, adjusting the magnification, changing the light, even pulling out a jeweler's loupe for closer inspection. At last, he leaned back. "The thread is correct for the period," he said. "Cotton, not synthetic. The stitching method matches mid-19th century needlework." He paused, removing his glasses to clean them, a nervous habit Sarah recognized. But the skill needed to make numbers this small, this exact, with the tools available to an enslaved child. "I know," Sarah said softly. "It shouldn't be possible, but it's there." Marcus stood and walked to the window overlooking the National Mall. "Have you identified the girl or the man beside her?" Sarah pulled up her research file on the main screen. The estate that donated the daguerreotype included some paperwork. "The man is Nathaniel Duchamp, owner of Belle Reve Plantation about 15 miles upriver from New Orleans. Successful sugar producer. He died in 1859, just a year after this photo was taken. The girl, nothing. She's listed only as enslaved child, unidentified. I checked Belle Reve's surviving records at the Louisiana State Archives, birth logs, sale records, everything. Children that young were rarely named unless they were sold. Marcus returned to the microscope and stared at the girl's face. She wanted someone to find this. The question is, why? The Louisiana State Archives in Baton Rouge sat in a modern building that felt strangely disconnected from the history inside. Sarah made the 3-hour drive from Washington, D.C., with one goal: find any record of what happened at Belle Reve Plantation between 1858 and 1859. The archivist, an elderly woman named Mrs. Beatrice Thibodeau, had prepared several boxes after Sarah's phone call. Belle Reve was very prosperous until Duchamp's death, she explained as she led Sarah into the research room. After that, the property changed owners many times. Most plantation records were lost in a fire in 1891. Sarah's heart dropped. Most? There are fragments, Mrs. Thibodeau said. Some letters, a partial ledger from 1858, and this. She placed a leather-bound journal on the table. Duchamp's personal diary. Donated by a distant relative in 1963. Hardly anyone has looked at it. Sarah opened the journal carefully. The pages were yellowed but intact, filled with Duchamp's tight handwriting. Most entries were ordinary: weather notes, sugar prices, social visits. Then she reached an entry, dated August 3, 1858, 2 weeks before the daguerreotype's date. The girl saw. I'm certain of it. She was in the barn when I returned with the documents. Her eyes are too sharp, too aware. I cannot risk her speaking. Though who would believe a slave child? Still I watch her. She now works in the house where I can observe her at all times. Sarah's heart pounded. She photographed the page and kept reading. The next entry of interest was dated August 17, 1858. Had our portrait taken today as planned. The photographer from New Orleans arrived at dawn. I stood with the girl on purpose. Let there be record of her presence here should questions arise later. Though I have been careful, one can never be too cautious. The matter is buried and will remain so. Mrs. Thibodeau stood beside Sarah, peering over her glasses. What matter? She whispered. I don't know, Sarah replied, but I think this girl was trying to tell us. Back in Washington, Sarah put together a small team. Marcus Williams brought in Dr. James Foster, a historian specializing in antebellum Louisiana, and Detective Robert Chen, Sarah's brother, who took leave from the D.C. Metropolitan Police to assist with what had become more an academic research. They met in the Conservation Lab conference room, the daguerreotype projected onto a large screen. The girl's face, magnified to 10 feet tall, seemed to watch them silently. I searched every New Orleans newspaper archive from 1858 and 1859, James said, spreading papers across the table. There was a major unsolved case during that time. On July 28, 1858, a federal marshal named Thomas Beaumont disappeared while investigating illegal slave trading in the Louisiana bayous. Illegal? Robert asked. Slavery was legal. The international slave trade wasn't, James replied. It was banned in 1808, but smuggling continued, especially through Louisiana waterways. Beaumont was building a case against several powerful planters. He paused. Including Nathaniel Duchamp. Sarah felt everything fall into place. Duchamp killed him. There's no direct proof, James cautioned. Beaumont simply vanished. His investigation ended with him. He pulled out another clipping dated March 1859, and Duchamp himself died less than a year later. Official cause was sudden illness, but rumors spread. Some said guilt drove him mad. Others whispered poison, that someone on the plantation may have taken justice into their own hands. Marcus studied the timeline Sarah had drawn on the whiteboard. July 28th, Beaumont disappears. August 3rd, Duchamp writes that the girl saw something. August 17th, the daguerreotype is taken with coordinates hidden in her sleeve. March 1859, Ducha. MP dies. The coordinates, Robert said. They must point to where Duchamp hid evidence of Beaumont's murder. Sarah pulled up a modern satellite image. Dense wetlands, thick with cypress trees, now protected federal land. After 166 years, could anything still be there? Depends, Robert said. If it's documents in a sealed container, buried above the waterline maybe, but we'd be searching for something briefcase-sized in 30 square miles of swamp." "She gave exact coordinates," Sarah said, looking back at the girl's face on the screen. "She risked everything to leave that message. We have to try." 3 weeks later, Sarah stood at the edge of Lake Pontchartrain as dawn light spread across the water. The expedition had required permits from the National Park Service, cooperation from local authorities, and help from Dr. Raymond Arsenault, a forensic archaeologist from Tulane University who specialized in wetland excavations. The team gathered on a small dock: Sarah, Marcus, Robert, James, Raymond, and 2 graduate students assisting with recovery. They loaded gear onto 2 flat-bottom boats, ground-penetrating radar, metal detectors, digging tools, and documentation cameras. "The coordinates place us about 40 minutes north," Raymond said, checking his GPS. "The good news is the ground there is slightly higher, likely a natural levee even in 1858. The bad news is a century and a half of sediment and plant growth. The boats moved into narrow waterways beneath. Hanging Spanish moss and towering cypress trees. The modern world faded quickly, replaced by something older and watchful." Sarah imagined the girl, still unnamed in every record they had found, traveling this route in reverse, perhaps hidden, carrying a terrible secret. "There," Raymond said, glancing at the GPS. They reached a small island barely 30 feet wide, thick with palmetto and wild grapevine. "This is it. Radar first. We dig only if we get a clear signal." As Raymond and his students began scanning, Sarah watched the radar screen show layers of soil, roots, and the faint shapes of buried stumps. Then, in the northeast section, something stood out. A rectangular shape, about 4 feet underground. "Did you find something?" Raymond asked quietly. "Man-made," one student replied. "Metal, maybe wood, heavily decayed." They began digging carefully, documenting each layer. The Louisiana heat pressed down, the air heavy and wet. 2 hours later, one of the students called out sharply. Her trowel had struck something solid. Raymond knelt beside her and gently brushed the soil away with his fingers. A dark shape appeared, metal, badly rusted but still solid, the clear edge of a box. Sarah's heart pounded as they slowly cleared the earth around it. The container was about 2 feet long, made of iron, with traces of an old wax seal along the seam. It had been buried on purpose, carefully placed by someone who wanted it hidden but also protected. "Let's bring it up, Eamon said quietly. "We'll open it at the lab." The conservation lab at Tulane University was designed for work like this. The metal box rested on an examination table, still coated in 166 years of swamp mud, while Raymond's team prepared to open it under controlled conditions. Sarah stood beside Marcus behind a glass partition. Robert and James leaned close to the monitors, watching live camera feeds from every angle. Raymond worked slowly, using special tools to ease open the corroded seam. The wax seal had long broken down, but it had served its purpose. The inside of the box looked mostly dry. After 20 careful minutes, the lid came free with a harsh scraping sound. Inside, wrapped in oilcloth that had mostly fallen apart, were papers. Raymond lifted them with shaking hands and placed them on a tray. Against all odds, despite time, moisture, and pressure, the documents were remarkably intact. The first item was a letter written in formal handwriting on official United States government stationery. James read it aloud through the intercom. From the desk of Federal Marshal Thomas Beaumont, dated July 25, 1858. To be delivered to the District Attorney of New Orleans upon my return. I have gathered sufficient evidence to prosecute Nathaniel Duchamp of Belle Reve Plantation for violations of the act prohibiting the importation of slaves. Enclosed are bills of sale for 17 African captives smuggled through Barataria Bay in June of this year, along with correspond. NCE between Duchamp and Captain Henri Mercier of the vessel Nightingale, documenting payment of $3,000 for said captives. The room fell completely silent. This was it, the evidence that vanished with Beaumont. "There's more," Raymond said, carefully separating the remaining papers. bills of sale just as Beaumont described, a ledger showing payments, and at the bottom of the box a small leather-bound notebook. Sarah's breath caught. "That's the same notebook," she whispered. "The one in the daguerreotype. The girl is holding it." Raymond opened it carefully. The pages were filled with neat columns of numbers, dates, and initials. "This is a smuggling ledger," he said. "Duchamp's own record of his illegal business. Dates, prices, sources." If Beaumont had brought this to court, Marcus said quietly, Duchamp would have been ruined. Prison, maybe even execution. Robert pressed his hand against the glass. So Duchamp killed Beaumont, took the evidence, and buried it where he thought no one would ever find it. But the girl saw him. She knew what he did, and somehow she left us a way to uncover the truth. James studied the daguerreotype now displayed beside the open box. "Look how Duchamp arranged her in the photo. She's holding his notebook, the proof of his crimes, right in her hands. He thought it showed his power over her, that even if she knew, she was helpless. But she wasn't," Sarah said softly. "She found a way, with Duchamp's crime confit. Ahmed." Sarah became determined to identify the girl. She returned to Bellerive's surviving records with new urgency, searching for any enslaved child between 10 and 14 living on the plantation in August 1858. Mrs. Thibodeau at the Louisiana State Archives worked closely with her. Together they compared plantation inventories, tax lists, and church baptism records from nearby parishes. At last, in a water-damaged ledger from 1857, they found an entry that made Sarah's hands shake. Purchased from the estate of Widow Mercier, one girl child approximately 11 years old, skilled in needlework and house duties, price $400. Name listed as Deline Mercier. Sarah whispered the surname. The same name as the ship captain mentioned in Beaumont's letter. Mrs. Thibodeau was already pulling another file. The Mercier family was well known in New Orleans. Henri Mercier was a merchant captain. His mother, widow Catherine Mercier, ran a dressmaking business that employed enslaved seamstresses famous for extremely fine work. Everything fit together. Delphine had been trained in needlework precise enough to create the tiny embroidery hidden in her sleeve. When Widow Mercier died and her estate was sold, Delphine was purchased by Duchamp, whose smuggling operation involved Widow Mercier's son. Delphine would have known that household, Sarah said aloud. She would have seen papers, heard conversations. When she arrived at Bellerive and saw Duchamp with Beaumont's evidence and saw Captain Mercier's name, she understood. An 11-year-old child understood federal law and smuggling? Mrs. Thibodeau asked doubtfully. She had spent her whole life watching and listening, Sarah replied. Enslaved people were expected to be invisible. That meant they saw everything. Delphine knew Beaumont was a marshal investigating the Merciers. She knew the notebook was proof of serious crimes, and she knew Beaumont had disappeared. Marcus, who had driven down to Baton Rouge to join them, added another document. "I found Duchamp's will. When he died in March 1859, his property was sold to pay debts, including his slaves. There's an auction record dated April 15, 1859. Sarah scanned the list. There it was. Deline, age approximately 12, sold to a buyer listed as J. Morrison, New Orleans. After that, the trail stopped. Morrison is a very common name, Mrs. Thibodeau said. It could be anyone. But Sarah felt closer to Delphine than ever, the girl who risked everything to expose a murderer, who stitched invisible coordinates into her sleeve, who stood in a photograph, holding the proof of the crime she witnessed. "We need to know what happened to her," Sarah said. "She deserves her full story." The search led Sarah to the Louisiana division of the New Orleans Public Library, where city directories and business records from the antebellum era were preserved on microfilm. She spent 3 long days scrolling through endless names, searchy, NG for J. Morrison. In 1859, she found 7. A lawyer, a doctor, 2 merchants, a hotel owner, a shipping agent, and a school teacher. Then she found something that made her heart race. Jonathan Morrison, the school teacher, was a known abolitionist. He had openly criticized slavery in letters to local newspapers. But abolitionists didn't buy slaves, Robert said when Sarah called him. Sometimes they did, Sarah replied, to free them. It was rare, but it happened. She found Morrison's address, a house on Dauphine Street in the French Quarter. The building still stood, now divided into apartments. The current owner allowed Sarah access to old property records stored in the basement. There, in a wooden box untouched for decades, she found them. Notarized manumission papers dated May 2, 1859, freeing one female child of African descent named Delphine, approximately 12 years old, purchased at auction for the sole purpose of granting freedom. Attached was a handwritten letter from Morrison. This child came to me under the most unusual circumstances. At the auction, she approached me directly, an act of great courage, and said only this: "I know where the truth is buried." Later, in private, she told me a story of murder and hidden evidence that I might have dismissed as fantasy had it not been for the detail and precision of her account. I have reported her testimony to federal authorities, though I fear little will come of it now that Duchamp is dead. I have freed this remarkable child and arranged for her education and care with a family traveling north to Philadelphia, where she may have a future worthy of her intelligence and bravery. Sarah sat back, tears running down her face. Delphine had lived. She had been freed. She had spoken the truth, but the story continued. Sarah traveled next to Philadelphia, where the letter said Delphine had been sent. The Historical Society of Pennsylvania held records of the city's free black community in the 1860s. Dr. Angela Wright, an archivist there, became deeply interested in the search. The 1860 census might list her, Dr. Wright said. If she arrived in late 1859, she would appear there. They searched through hundreds of entries until they found her. Deline Morrison, listed as a ward in the household of Frederick and Martha Wilson, free black residents who ran a boarding house on South Street. Dr. Wright smiled. The Wilsons were important figures. Frederick Wilson was a conductor on the Underground Railroad and a member of the Pennsylvania Anti-Slavery Society. This makes sense. The records continued. Church rolls, city directories. In 1865, Delphine appeared as a member of Mother Bethel AME Church. In 1867, she was listed as a student at the Institute for Colored Youth, one of the first schools in the nation to offer a full education to black students. Then Sarah found something that took her breath away. A marriage record dated June 15, 1872. Delphine Morrison married Jack Reynolds, a teacher at the institute. Her age was listed as 25. Occupation, school teacher. She became a teacher, Sarah whispered. Dr. Wright continued searching. Birth records appeared. Samuel Reynolds, born in 1873, then 3 more children between 1873 and 1880. The family stayed in Philadelphia. Jacob Reynolds later became principal of the Institute for Colored Youth. Delphine taught there for over 30 years. She died in 1921. Dr. Wright found the death certificate, age 74, buried at Eden Cemetery with her husband and 2 of her children. Sarah sat quietly taking in the full span of Delphine's life, from an enslaved child and witness to murder, to an educator who shaped generations. The coordinates stitched into her sleeve were more than evidence. They were an act of resistance, a refusal to let truth disappear. "Are there descendants?" Sarah asked. Dr. Wright smiled. "I'll make some calls." 6 months later, a crowd gathered in New Orleans for a traveling exhibition from the Smithsonian's National Museum of African American History and Culture. The daguerreotype of Delphine and Nathaniel Duchamp was displayed alongside the recovered documents and the full story of her courage. Sarah focused on the family standing before the display. 3 generations of Delphine's descendants, 12 people in all, from an elderly great-great-granddaughter to a 5-year-old boy who kept asking about Grandma Deline. The oldest, Mrs. Dorothy Harrison, held a photograph of her grandmother, Delphine's youngest daughter, taken in 1910. The resemblance was clear, the same steady eyes, the same quiet strength. "We knew she came from Louisiana," Mrs. Harrison said softly. We knew she was born enslaved, but we never knew what she did, how brave she was. Marcus addressed the crowd. Delphine was 11 years old when she witnessed a murder and understood that evidence of that crime had been buried to protect a powerful man. She had no rights, no voice, no power, but she had intelligence, courage, and extraordinary skill. She left a message for the future, hidden in plain sight. He gestured toward the image. For 166 years, she stood in this photograph holding the proof of those crimes. And all that time, written in thread so fine it was nearly invisible, she was telling us where to look. Sarah watched as the family gathered close, touching the glass, speaking quietly to the girl who had given them this gift. The 5-year-old tugged on Sarah's sleeve. "Is that really my great-great-great-grandma?" "Yes," Sarah said, kneeling beside him, "and she was one of the bravest people who ever lived." He looked again at the picture. Why did she hide the numbers in her dress? "Because sometimes," Sarah said gently, "when you can't say the truth out loud, you have to find another way to tell it." And she knew someday people like you would want to know her story. The boy nodded and ran back to his family. Sarah looked once more at Delphine's face, no longer unnamed, no longer lost, no longer silent. The photograph had guarded her secret for 166 years, but her message had finally been heard, and the truth she risked everything to protect would never be buried again.